Welcome everybody. This is the Managing Agile Value Chain session. I'd like to thank Rowan Nelson from ABARES for hosting the session. And we'll have 4 presentations today on the topic. Then we'll go to questions at the end. So GRDC has sponsored this session. So GRDC has a strong interest obviously in the data and analytics that come out of ABARES, and we're very happy to support this session. So this is a very topical point at the moment. So as we move from a drought year into a boom year, how do we manage supply and supply chain and the responses that our industry partners have to do to maintain grain processing functionality and quality, including our domestic processors, feeders, export demand, and do all that with trade restrictions. So this session will highlight some of those challenges, and hopefully we'll get to hear what some of the participants are doing to manage those issues. So I've got a few housekeeping notes. You can submit questions via the upvote questions via the presentation on the left menu. The second one is the live Q&A will be at the end of the session after all the presentations. We'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible. If the speaker has given permission, their slides will be available in the resources tab for you to download. And finally, the session will be recorded and available under the sessions catch-up tab after 24 hours. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Amelia Brown from ABARES. Amelia leads the crop team in ABARES, the Agricultural Forecasting Policy section. She is the wheat analyst contributing to ABARES commodity publication, and also part of the team that produces the Australian Crop Report. She has got a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Sydney, and I'll pass it over to you, Amelia.
Hi, my name's Amelia Brown, and today I'm going to be taking you through ABARES' outlook for grains. This chart illustrates how variable Australia's winter crop production can be. ABARES estimates that Australia produced over 55 million tonnes of grains and oilseeds in 2021, compared to just 29 million tonnes in the previous year. At 33 million tonnes, wheat production was record high and more than double what was produced in 1920. Barley production is estimated to have increased by 45% and canola by 74%. New South Wales and Western Australia are typically the 2 biggest producers, but as you can see, this varies significantly depending on seasonal conditions. Ideal conditions in New South Wales in 2021 resulted in a record wheat crop. Conditions are pretty much ideal from pre-planting through to harvest. The story was the complete opposite in Western Australia this year. It was pretty remarkable they were able to produce an above average crop, considering they received below to very much below average rainfall. This is a testament to the advances in farming practices and technology being used to combat our very unpredictable climate. During the East Coast drought, Western Australia and South Australia were able to produce plenty to meet domestic demand. We saw a lot of grain moving from Western Australia and South Australia into New South Wales and Queensland to supply the intensive livestock industries. With the East Coast having to reorient from being an exporter to an importer of grain, and our traditional exporting states diverting grain to the domestic market. During the drought, low supply, increased domestic use, and prohibitive costs associated with importing grain resulted in Australian wheat prices being well above export parity. Australia's major markets in Southeast Asia sourced wheat from cheaper origins, including Argentina and the Black Sea region. With a significant increase in supply in 2021, Australian wheat prices are now competitive compared to other origin wheat, which is expected to result in Australia regaining market share in our traditional markets. We exported 2.5 million tonnes of wheat in December 2020, just shy of the record monthly shipment, which was in May 2017. The difference between now and the bumper 2016-17 crop are export prices. Outcomes for producers will be much better this year. Oil prices are higher at the moment because of concerns about the Northern Hemisphere production 21-22 crop, particularly in the Black Sea in the United States. A surge in import demand from China for all grains and oilseeds as a result of their growing intensive livestock industries, and Russian export restrictions put in place to try and curtail domestic food inflation. It's a rare combination to have a bumper crop and high prices, which is great for Australian producers. World grain prices are forecast to average lower in 21-22, reflecting higher production and a fall in import demand. World wheat consumption is forecast to increase to a new record, while world corn consumption is forecast to remain relatively flat. Demand is expected to continue increasing over the medium term in line with population growth, changing diets, and rising incomes. Prices are projected to fall gradually in real terms over the period as world supply grows faster than demand. This assumes that there are no significant shocks to global production. As my first two charts illustrate, it's very difficult to predict what will happen year to year with Australia's climate. ABARES medium-term forecasts are based on the average outcome of 4 possible seasonal climate scenarios, with varying combinations of predicted rainfall and in which year of the outlook period it is received. Upside and downside scenarios were also considered. A more detailed explanation is included in the agricultural overview of the AC. Area planted to wheat in Australia in 21-22 will largely depend on rainfall received between now and the end of autumn. However, following a La Nina in 2021, production outcomes across much of the country are more likely to be average to above average due to higher soil moisture at planting. Wheat production is forecast to fall to around 25 million tonnes, reflecting a fall in average yields from the record highs achieved this year, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria. Australian exports are forecast to more than double to 21 million tonnes. This would be the highest level since 2016-17 and well above the 10-year average. Closing stocks are forecast to be replenished from the very low level at the end of 2019-20 and are forecast to be drawn down over the projection period unless we have another bumper crop. The industry is more resilient because farms are much more productive than they were in the past. As farms have consolidated, land and resources have been transferred from smaller, less productive farms to much bigger, much more productive farms. This has made us globally more competitive. The industry is also more resilient because it has more international marketing options than in the past. Post-deregulation, there has been a significant expansion of small traders with the flexibility to take advantage of niche marketing opportunities in world markets. There has also been a diversification of domestic markets for grain, with the number of small to medium processors, such as milling, cereal, pasta, and baking, increasing. Changes in global supply are the key determinant of world grain prices. The projection of declining prices over the medium term assumes seasonal conditions in major producers will lead to roughly average outcomes. However, increasingly variable climatic conditions mean that one or more of the major producers is likely to experience well above or below average seasonal conditions in the next 5 years. This will add variability to the projected trends in production, exports, and prices. Export restrictions interfere with global markets. Russia has introduced various grain export quotas and taxes in an effort to stabilise domestic food inflation. This has led to price volatility, but it may also provide an opportunity for Australian exports to meet growing global import demand. Chinese tariffs on Australian barley imports have resulted in lower prices received for Australian barley, which is expected to result in a fall in the area planted to barley, particularly in South Australia and Western Australia, who are more exposed to global markets. The industry has been able to adapt to the challenges such as drought and trade restrictions. Farms are getting bigger and more productive, and the domestic grains industry has grown and diversified. This has made value chains more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. That was great. So our next speaker is James Murray from Viterra. So James is a Chief Operations Officer for Viterra in Australia. He's got 20 years of experience in the grains industry. Prior to joining Viterra in 2011, James held multiple port and upcountry supply chain roles in Victoria, South Australia and Queensland. And prior to this role, he was Chief Operations Officer in the Commercial and Logistics Group for Viterra. So over to you. Thanks, James.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to be talking about the Australian grain industry's resilience, and the role of the supply chains, which has really been well demonstrated over the past few years with multiple years of drought, market access changes, and a global pandemic. The industry demonstrated its ability to adapt in the lead up to the 2018-19 harvest, when drought conditions saw a well below average year on the East Coast. Low stocks carryover and a very small summer crop meant demand quickly began growing early 2018 on the East Coast. Growers were really the first to react and began moving their unsold grain longer distances into those markets. There were many changes at all levels of the supply chain to meet the demand on the East Coast, with location really impacting how each state's supply chain changed. In South Australia, the grain flow switched and began moving away from ports towards close to the border and even to our rail sites. We responded quickly and provided flexible service for our growers and our buyer customers. Our proximity to the East Coast allowed us to move grain by road, rail and by vessel. CBH's location in Western Australia meant its export-focused supply chain stayed relatively the same as they moved grain to the East Coast by a vessel. GrainCorp, being based in the East Coast, had to completely reverse its supply chain to unload vessels and move the grain into storage. With similar drought conditions in 2019-20, the Australian supply chain continued to successfully meet domestic demand on the East Coast for those two seasons, with around about 4 million tonnes of grain being transported from SA and WA to the eastern states each year. The growing conditions for the current 2020-21 harvest were significantly better than the previous drought years, creating a record crop, which the latest ABARES report is estimated at about 50 million tonnes or just slightly above. The majority of this has been produced on the East Coast, thankfully. The better year meant the Australian grain supply chain had to quickly revert back to the large export task. And Viterra successfully achieved this with near record shipping volumes through our ports in December and January, even with a whole new set of challenges brought about by COVID. The importance of the food supply chain and food security was highlighted early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw strong domestic demand for the food and feed commodities. These requirements were quickly satisfied through the Australian supply chains. The industry was able to prepare and plan for the best way to manage harvest through COVID, though the ever-changing situation meant that multiple contingency plans were developed and for different scenarios and restrictions to ensure the industry complied with the government guidelines. At Viterra, we were responsive to the changing situation. We liaised with government and have continued to operate our supply chains, receiving growers' grain at harvest and out-turning it to multiple buyers, both domestically and internationally. Our employees, customers and contractors have adapted exceptionally well to our changes, and that prioritised health and wellbeing of our employees, customers and the broader community. Export demand for Australia's new season grain picked up very quickly from around early October last year. We've seen strong demand through the Viterra network, and we've already shipped around 1.8 million tonnes through our South Australian ports up until the end of January. And we still have solid bookings in our network right up until May and even a little bit beyond. Our supply chain has transitioned back to a more export focus, and we've re-established our relationships with our export customers. The industry has also been able to build new relationships with the redirection of grain into markets such as Saudi Arabia, after access to some markets were either restricted or closed. Australia's grain reputation and consistent quality meant we have re-entered these markets and we've seen strong demand. The resilience of the Australian grain industry and our ability to return to our traditional export focus following those difficult years is reliant on the Australian grain remaining competitive into these international markets. Australia produces consistently good quality grain with high specs, low moisture and contaminant free. And this is supported by the quality management of grain in Australia, and that also gives our industry a huge competitive edge. Buyers can be confident that our food safety and quality management standards are some of the highest in the world. And in a time when consumers are becoming increasingly aware of traceability and what ingredients their food contains, having that confidence in Australian grade does make a massive difference. The Viterra network is well equipped to meet the needs with our focus on traceability, high quality and food safety standards. We've continued to invest in our state-of-the-art, purpose-built laboratory, including expanding our chemical residue testing capabilities. We're also continuing to invest in grain classification right across our network. We've held our food safety and quality certifications for more than 20 years. It's the highest of any grain supply chain in Australia and applies to all of our facilities. Australian grain enters the market at a very, very good time. Just as other origin crops are depleting, the size of Australia and the efficient supply chains mean many of the tonnes can enter the market at once when harvest begins. And a reliable summer means that there's very few hold-ups when loading vessels. The dynamic nature and the environment we operate in, which has been demonstrated by drought, changing market demands, and the essential nature of the food supply chain during COVID, highlight the need to be able to adapt to ensure services are maintained. The regulation imposed on the industry, and in particular the grain supply chains, through the Wheat Port Access Code, needs to be appropriate for the environment and allow for the supply chains to deliver flexibility customers need to fully realise the value of Australian grain and deliver the value to Australian growers. Australian growers are a key part of what makes Australian grain competitive in international markets. Their on-farm practices, focus on quality, and the active engagement with the industry all contribute how successfully we can enter those markets. Our industry's resilience is an ongoing process of adapting to change, embracing new and innovative ways to collaborate to ensure we deliver value for Australian grain. This value is ultimately delivered back to growers and for the prosperity of the Australian grain agricultural sector. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and I'll join the panel session shortly and happy to take questions there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, James. We're now going to switch over to import constraints, and Craig Scheibel from the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment will give us a update on some of the issues that were occurring with imports. So Craig is the Assistant Director, Plant Import Operations at the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. He's worked in the import and export sides within the department's plant programs and currently manages the importations of seeds and grain for human consumption and importation of bulk whole grains. So over to you. Thanks, Craig.
G'day everyone, my name is Craig Scheibel. I'm an Assistant Director within Plant Import Operations Branch in the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Today I'm going to speak about the challenges that were faced during the drought, specifically around when the interest in the importation of whole grain increased, and we had some applications come in to allow for applying for the importation of whole grain. A little bit of history first. I won't go too much into this, but Australia's previously imported grain during periods of major Australian drought. This occurred in 94, 95, 02, 03, and in 06, 07. Since these times, there's been changes in pest status in overseas countries and changes in requirements for importation as a result of those changes in pest status, etc. The Imported Grain Operational Response Document that established the conditions for importation of grain and procedures for managing the risk that was used in those previous imported campaigns was reviewed and updated to take into account some of the changes into the Importing Bulk Grain Guideline, and we published that in July 2019. As most of you would be aware, the decision to import grain is a commercial decision by the importer, and the department's responsibility is to ensure that any imports do not compromise Australia's biosecurity status. We do this by regulating the importation of goods into Australia through our legal powers under the Biosecurity Act 2015. All controls and processes put in place by the department are to ensure that risks associated with imported grain can be managed to meet Australia's appropriate level of protection, which is very low but not zero. And this is done through a combination of sourcing clean grain, implementing permit conditions and onshore measures. So it's a combination of offshore and onshore requirements. The department received many inquiries with regard to importation of whole grain during the drought, and these varied from small opportunistic importers to large animal productions and stock feed companies. Many of the inquiries didn't progress past the initial discussions once the department explained the requirements of the pathway and the requirements of the offshore and onshore components. However, there were 4 import pathways that progressed to the assessment stage. The assessment stage of these pathways included a desk audit to establish compliance, at least at a desk audit level, against the requirements of the guideline. But then, of course, we moved to an on-site audit to validate and evaluate operational suitability. Of the 4 pathways, only 1 proceeded to approval and actually had permits issued against it. I'd like to speak about the issues that were encountered during this process and the main reasons why we only ended up with 1 pathway approved. I'd have to say the biggest issue that was found was the lack of infrastructure in Australia that could meet the import requirements. As you'd be aware, the majority of our grain handling sites and ports, etc., are geared toward export, which is understandable because in normal years we export a lot of grain. However, when we need to import these grains in these times of drought, it was clear that we had some significant issues, and it became apparent fairly quickly. The challenges we faced along the pathway can be broken, I guess, into offshore and onshore. With regard to the offshore challenges, the ability to source grain that meets our requirements. So imported grain may have requirements regarding place of production, so area freedoms, even conditions regarding harvest methods, storage restrictions, requirements for transport, segregation of that grain if it's being loaded out through terminals, and of course if it's being stored off-site or at terminals, making sure that product preservation and that it's not getting contaminated with grain that may not meet our requirements. Because of some of the biosecurity requirements, higher grades of grain may need to be sourced than you would normally do, for example, for stock feed. So if you're sourcing feed grain, because of the requirements to foreign material and contaminants, etc., you may need to in fact source grade 1 or grade 2, depending on the country and how their grading system works. But the department and Australia's requirements for foreign material and contaminants are quite high, which means that prospective importers will need to source higher classes of grain or higher quality of grain with less foreign material and contaminants that maybe they're used to sourcing. So, of course, that adds an upward pressure on the costs. With regard to onshore, the lack of suitable infrastructure, as I mentioned before, was certainly one of the main things that we faced. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about everything from storage, segregation within those storage sites, the ability to isolate silos and pathways, security of that site so that we know the grain is there and it's not being moved, site suitability, so where the physical site is located, the department assesses those, dust control measures, spillage of grain, hygiene, management of waste, dust filters and waste, clean down, decommissioning processes, all of those things were proven to be major challenges for the existing infrastructure. And in most cases, in order to meet department requirements, the sites would have required, or the department would have did request significant infrastructure changes to meet our requirements. Now, they would have involved major capital works to revise pathways, to revise dust management, to change product flows within, to implement new processes and procedures, new staff training, a change of culture. I'll use that terminology to getting to the point where staff all staff who are working on the site recognise that we can't have grain lying around. It can't be exposed to rodents and birds. Obviously, bird and pest control within sites was something that we had a particular focus on. So, of course, then we need to look at spilled grain, product flows, pathways, security of those pathways, so covered conveyors, dust leaks, etc., etc. All of those type of changes and capital works involved a significant cost, and that was the feedback we received from industry, of course, was that there was a significant cost involved with making sites or bringing sites up to the standard that would meet our requirements. And of course, the time that would be taken to make some of those capital changes was significant, and it's not something that could have been done quickly. So to meet a demand of imported grain, we're talking about programs that need to be considered when there's not that pressure of the need to import. There are also some concerns raised by stakeholders and end users that the times and temperatures required by the department had the potential to impact nutritional value of the feed, which would have meant recalculation of formulation of diets, etc., which is obviously, again, that's another concern for those end users. And changing diets of animals and things like that quickly has its own challenges. So that's another thing to consider, I guess, in when you have to reformulate diets. You'll need to be considering that relatively early in an import program to make sure that you're allowing that appropriate time to change. There was no site available immediately to offer, and I'll use this term, a third-party service. So there was no site at a port or anywhere that could unload, store, treat the grain, and I use that treat word meaning process the grain to mitigate the risks associated, and thus allowing grain to be used by smaller end users. So the inquiries that we had by and large were by companies who needed to consume the grain within their own programs. So the larger companies could do that or consider doing that, but a lot of small end users or smaller producers or smaller manufacturers, there was no site that could offer to do that service of storage and processing, which would then allow that grain or that processed product to be on-sold for use in a wider spread domestic market. There's also the need for the sites to be approved arrangements with the department and the specific requirements for transport routes, transport types, tracking, emergency plans, all of those things. Again, getting approval as an AA takes time, getting emergency plans, infrastructure, all of these things take place. And it's not something, it was clear that it's not something that can be done quickly. And indeed, many of the companies who expressed an interest in importing grain have noted to us that they're continuing to work on that, knowing that if and when a drought occurs next time, they will need to have systems in place, prepared and ready, in order to enable that importation of grain to occur. There's also the issue around commitment to import. In some cases, the intention to import or have the ability to import was more important to potential applicants than the actual part of importing grain. Stakeholders wanted to have access to a valid permit in order to say we could import grain, but we don't want to, and they were using it as a trigger to influence domestic price. The other part of it was in the most recent drought, there was a significant movement of grain from west to east, which meant that segregation and storage was still at somewhat of a premium in port locations, and the ability to segregate domestic and imported grain was really challenging with the infrastructure that was in place. Thanks for your time. This was a really brief overview. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. That was a really detailed summary of some of the issues there that we're facing. Our next speaker is Professor Mark Howden. He's Director of the Climate Change Institute at ANU, Australian National University. He's Honorary Professor at University of Melbourne, Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and a member of the ACT Climate Change Council. Mark's going to provide us with an overview of climate change and how that influences variation in supply. Over to you. Thanks, Mark.
I'd like to thank the organisers for this opportunity to talk today about trade and grains and climate change. Now, firstly, climate change by itself is likely to significantly affect agricultural production and particularly cereal production across the globe. It's likely to affect the geographical distribution, the yield variability, and the quality of products from farms, and particularly of crops, which are highly sensitive to season variation. Now, overall, these impacts are likely to be negative, but in some parts of the world, it could actually be positive. And so those places will be relatively advantaged. And we can see from this map here, which is one of several similar products, that largely it's the top latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere that are going to be advantaged, with disadvantages across the rest of the world, including Australia. If we actually want to understand how this may impact on the real world, of course, it's going to interact with other factors. So it's going to be impacted by other scenario elements, such as population growth, the affluence of that population, the consumption patterns of the population, and the policy environment, including policies associated with greenhouse gas emission reduction. So these things together would jointly affect prices received and costs. And in almost all studies that I've seen, grain prices are likely to increase out into the future with climate change when we take into account these other factors. Now, of course, we're not going to sit back and not respond to that. We're going to adapt to those changes. And those adaptation options, including agronomic changes, technical changes, and also land use changes, where people swap from one land use to another. But they'll also importantly include trade changes. So how much trade and to whom and when we trade. And when we actually look at these trade scenarios, we see that prices tend to increase less with more flexible trade arrangements, and they increase more when there's trade barriers. And so how we organise ourselves in the face of climate change and trade will matter. If we want to think about that trade, it's also important to think about greenhouse gas emissions, which are the key driver of climate change. So when we look at scenarios which have high emissions and also correspondingly high climate change, those tend to result in a much more centralised trade network where there's dominance by a relatively few countries. And in those scenarios which we have ambitious mitigation scenarios, so lowering greenhouse gases rapidly, that tends to result in a more distributed and stable system, in part because the climate changes themselves are lower. And if we want to think about a climate change, greenhouse gas constrained world, the greenhouse gas emissions of trade themselves need to be included and considered. So for example, we need to explore ways to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of traded goods. So for example, Maersk, the big shipping line, has just ordered its first methanol-powered large ship so that they can move to renewable energy as part of an overall net zero strategy for that company. We also need to think about carbon border adjustments. So some jurisdictions applying essentially a tax on goods which are being imported into that jurisdiction to offset the lack of a carbon price in the country of source. And so if we think about Australia, some of our goods actually may be penalised in that circumstance, but some may be advantaged because we, in many cases, in our agriculture, we are very efficient and our total greenhouse gas footprint may be well lower than that of similar goods produced in the EU themselves. So there could be positives or negatives depending on how we operate and also how that adjustment mechanism operates. Now, there needs to be some caveats in relation to these sorts of analyses. Firstly, there's substantial variation between economic models and the results they produce. And this builds on variation in the climate models and also in the crop models. So we essentially have a bit of a cascade of uncertainty. So we don't want to emphasize the results of any particular model. Secondly, these economic models tend to operate from average change in yields. But it's becoming increasingly clear that climate change is not only driving the average yields, but also yield variability, and doing that very substantially already. And so that change in yield variability is likely to drive changes in prices, changes in costs, changes in risks, and changes in trade. So for example, this very recent study on drought shows how drought is likely to become much worse over the next decades. And unfortunately, Australia is one of the hotspots for increasing drought, along with around the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of South America. So that's going to be a core driver of that variability and a core driver of prices and the structures of our industries within Australia. And just a couple of other caveats is that competition for land and for water from carbon sequestration, production of biofuels, or renewable energy, such as solar photovoltaics, could actually be quite significant. And there's just one example of that. In the last IPCC special report for 1.5 degrees, produced in 2018, a core scenario in there to keep temperatures down below 1.5 degrees had a land area about the size of Australia being planted under trees so it could produce energy under the bioenergy carbon capture and storage scheme, which was needed to actually offset fossil fuels. So this is a scenario which had high continuation of fossil fuel emissions, which needed a high degree of offsets through BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So just a quick summary is that what I've tried to show here today is that climate change is likely to impact on crops, it's likely to impact on adaptation, it's likely to impact on trade. And it's how all of these things fit together and how we respond to this, which is the challenge ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think that's going to set the premise very well for an interesting discussion session, which will follow shortly. So let's bring in each of the speakers and we'll go directly into that discussion session. Thank you for those presentations, everyone. Great job. Can we just do a little check around the room that we've got everyone? So Mark, you're on?
Yep.
Craig?
Yep.
James?
Yes.
Amelia?
Yes.
Great, excellent, thank you. So just to recap, so Amelia told us about the variability in crop production going from drought 2 years ago to record crop in this current year. James from Viterra discussed the challenges that grain handlers experience moving grain from upcountry down to port and the challenges with quality. Craig discussed all the issues that were apparent in importing grain back into the country and those challenges around the infrastructure of port handling. And then we had Mark Howden discussing climate change and how that might affect yields around the country, particularly on a global scale and Australia in particular. So what I want to do now is just open up to a few questions, and I'll kick off one for Mark first of all. So Mark, your map showed that there was a lot of grain variation expected in Australia. Can you try and provide us with a bit more detail about where in Australia you think the grain producing regions might be affected, please?
Thanks, Terence. I guess a first comment is that any of these projections is one of a set or portfolio of possibilities. And but really importantly for Australia is that the picture which has emerged over multiple studies is pretty consistent. And the message here is really 3 different zones or areas where those impacts are likely to be large. Firstly, in Western Australia, where the continuing decline in rainfall is likely to drive down yields, notwithstanding the fantastic job that farmers are doing in terms of improving water use efficiency. Secondly, in the northeast of our crop zones and also in the northern part of the WA cropping areas, is that higher temperatures bringing more extreme events, very hot periods, particularly during pollination, so during grain set, are likely to decrease yields. And thirdly, those areas which are at the dry margins of our existing cropping areas. So it's where we start to move from cropping into essentially just livestock running. Those dry margins are likely to be significantly and disproportionately affected. So reduction of cropping activity in those dry margins.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Next question, this one is to James. Given the growth in the East Coast domestic market combined with production volatility in New South Wales and Queensland, are you seeing new intensive livestock investments in SA attracted by export parity pricing and greater availability of grain in SA? That's from Ross Kingwell.
Yeah, look, I think overall, I think the investment in livestock, we've seen a little bit coming into the market in South Australia more recently. But overall, there hasn't been a significant increase in that space. As far as the grain availability, the domestic market is growing by a couple of % each year in South Australia, and we certainly expect that to continue over the short to medium term as well. But at the moment, it's not sort of growing above what we've probably seen over the last few years as well.
Great, thank you very much for that, James. Next question is to Craig. Why is it important to keep import pathways open in good seasons? When can we go back to being a net exporter? That one should be obvious this year is the answer, I think. Craig.
Yeah, I guess again, obviously we're moving into that positive turn now, but I think the previous drought showed, when we hadn't imported for a long time, and it showed when we started to move through it with changes in pest status overseas, movement of diseases around the world and things like that, the conditions and that had changed pretty dramatically. We updated our requirements. And what we have in place, it was a real struggle, I guess, to get pathways in place that could meet those requirements. So I think we need to be considering that as we move through, and this variation as it moves around. I think, when we've got good time, I'll use that term. When we've got good times, we need to be thinking about and ensuring that we've got systems in place and infrastructure in place for those times when we're not in such a positive position. And, the previous experience over the last year or so has shown that at the moment we don't have a lot of infrastructure in place that we can ramp up.
Great, thanks, Craig. This question is for Mark. Given the foreseeable climate and other interacting factors you talked about, do you think that the Australian grains industry will get more or less globally competitive over the next 20 years?
It's a really great question, and one we haven't got a good answer to. But a lot of it actually depends on how we respond to the prevailing circumstances. And those are likely to be that many of our competitors are also impacted by climate change in a negative way. So if they don't respond well, we will have a competitive advantage. If they respond well and we also respond well, it keeps things pretty much on a level playing field. So there is a question about the response which we undertake as in an industry and as a country. I think one of the critical things here is that everything points to a very substantial increase in variability of production in many places across the world. So the difference between the good years and the bad years is likely to increase. And that generates the sort of fluxes in exports and imports that we've been talking about here today, and also movements of grain across the country. And so these sort of issues about maintaining import markets so that we can bring material into Australia in a safe way, maintaining our export relationships and so that they're stable and robust in the face of variability. are going to become increasingly important, just like maintaining very effective and low greenhouse gas footprint trade routes across the world is going to become increasingly important.
Great, thank you, Mark. Amelia, a question for you. How do you think that the Chinese tariff on Australian barley will affect the area planted to barley in this coming year?
Thanks, Terence. Excuse me. ABARES has done a bit of analysis on this. Obviously, China was a high value market for Australian barley, effectively being priced out of that market with the tariff. We've had to divert into other markets which would have generally a lower value, which obviously impacts returns to growers. This year, I think, as in any year, it'll depend on the season, pre-season rainfall and prices of other competing crops. But we would assume that over the medium term, that area planted to barley is likely to fall, particularly in Western Australia and South Australia, where their domestic market is a lot smaller than the East Coast. They're probably likely to be ones that are more sort of look at what's going on globally and their access to markets and perhaps move into other crops, most likely wheat. But again, that will depend on international values of all grains when they're competing for area planted. But over the medium term, we sort of think that the area planted to barley will fall down to about 4 million hectares, where in the past it sort of has been up around 4.5, even 4.8 million hectares, sort of 5 or 6 years ago. So we sort of expect it to fall down to around 4 and then remain fairly consistent.
Great, thanks, Amelia. That's a good clarification there. This one I might address to James, but it refers to one of Mark's graphics. So one of the charts that Mark put up showed only some parts of the Northern Hemisphere benefiting from climate change. So what would that really mean for us as an exporter, James, competing against countries like Canada, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, those ones that will likely have beneficial climate impacts?
Yeah, I think one of the positives for is the timing of the Australian crop and where it does actually compete into the end market destinations versus when the Northern Hemisphere crop comes off. So at the moment, and expect that trend to continue, is that we come into the market at a really good time where there is a premium being paid from that period of, say, December to June. And that's largely what we're seeing, that the crop, particularly this year, it's not evenly spread out through the year when exports are there. It's more very front-ended. And I think that probably just gets more exacerbated if the drought conditions or the volatility in the Northern Hemisphere. It just, I suppose, provides an opportunity for Australian grain to go into those locations for probably a bit longer than just the 6-month period or what have you. So again, that quality that we do produce, it does give us that advantage. And if we can combine that with timing and supply, positions us quite well.
Thanks, James. I might just follow up on that one. So, given this variability in the domestic production and the variability in demand from domestic users, how does a company like Viterra situate itself so that it can supply those markets? In also thinking about that at the same time that growers are holding more grain on farm, how do you as a business manage both your own supply chain and that on-farm supply chain to ensure there's a supply available for those feedlot industries?
Yeah, I think that through the last 2 years of drought and then coming into a larger type season, it's just sort of average or slightly above in South Australia. But I think the first thing is about having that flexibility within the network and very much that adaptability that when the crop is larger, having that ability to flex up. And then also the other way. And that's certainly what growers do as well, is that in those lower volume type years that they have an ability to contract. And we work closely with our growers to understand their requirements, both at harvest and obviously post-harvest with deliveries as well. And I think for, say, a business such as ourselves, is we do have a long-term view, and that's where our investment, particularly into our assets and our supply chain, is really sustainable. We invest up to about $40 million a year in the supply chain, and that's really about making sure that when the growers want to deliver that grain to the customers, and that's obviously through our supply chain, that we have the capacity, we have the elevation to meet their needs at that critical point in time. And then also, throughout that is maintaining that quality throughout as well and tailoring that. So I think for our business, it's that continued investment, whether it's in our infrastructure, whether it's in our people, and working collaborative with growers and buyers to really connect those two together. And that's certainly what we see our place in the supply chain is.
Yeah, I'd be interested in a comment from any of the panel members on this next one. So given that there is a lot of market variation, what can the grains industry do to offset some of that risk that both the producers, handlers, and domestic users experience in the supply chain? So what sort of mechanisms are available to them to mitigate some of that variation? We're seeing growers with extra storage, handlers making more storage available, vertical, horizontal storage facilities. But I'm not sure about what the processing sector or feedlot sector is doing. So I'll just throw that one out there and see who has an opinion on that.
Look, I could probably take that one, Terence, for you. I think it probably aligns a little bit with what I was saying around the capacity of the supply chain and being able to, again, connect those growers to the end user, whether that's a domestic market or whether it is an international market as well. And you're right, is the on-farm market is growing, and I think that's where the efficiency of growers and the supply chain participants is really critical in managing that risk. Again, back to probably what I was saying before about accessing the market at the right time with the right quality to the right customer is going to really, I suppose, offset that risk and certainly, try and attract that premium. So having good quality operators throughout the supply chain and linking that together is going to be critical to offset it.
Have you had more customers forward buying, contracting, using swaps and options, all of that to lock in more tonnes for more out years or not?
Not necessarily. We probably haven't seen. We still see quite a bit of, particularly from the international side. There's a little bit of forward buying, but it's not any too far out the curve. So it's still a little bit spot at the moment. That's probably partly dictated by the current pricing levels as well. But certainly, as we expect to go into this coming season, we probably expect a little bit more forward buying.
Right. I might throw the next one back to Amelia. So, Amelia, during the last drought season, we saw prices in wheat and barley go $50 to $70 tonne above parity prices during the drought. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what sort of things were happening on the East Coast with substitution between the crops, please?
Yeah, sure. I think when we sort of say the last year's drought, it actually started in 2017-18 and has been pretty ordinary since, obviously, apart from this year. So I think from 17-18 onwards, we saw sort of a failure of a summer crop, then we went into a below average winter crop, then we had another summer crop failure, and it just sort of all compounded. At the same time, we had high livestock prices, so there's a massive surge in domestic feed demand. So then the substitution between, any grain, wheat, milling quality wheat was being fed to animals, I guess, because of the prices. So that really pushed domestic prices well above export parity. We also had, as Craig outlined, pretty difficult to import grain. I think the import pathways, there was a lot of interest, obviously because domestic prices were so high because of our lack of supply, but it's just, it's very difficult. Well, it's very expensive, I guess, to adhere to the strict biosecurity protocols, which really pushed prices even higher. So it was just a function of 3 years, really, of well below average production, a surge in domestic demand because it was still viable to feed grain to animals, even though it was so expensive because livestock prices were also high. So it was a bit of a combination of all those things that really pushed those prices to where we saw them. So yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Mark, I might switch a question back to you. So this one would be about, we talked about the areas that might be impacted negatively by climate change events in Australia, but what about those parts of the country that might expect more favourable conditions from climate change? Where might they be, and how might they do things differently? So what sort of temperature range might they experience, or rainfall changes might you expect?
Yeah, it's another good question. So what we're already seeing is an expansion of the grains activity into the wet margins. So those areas where it used to be high rainfall grazing, and so moving out from the pasture phase and into a cropping activity, and generally that build is a positive thing in the sense that there's a greater gross margin per hectare coming out of the cropping. So that climate change, which has dried out those areas, has already, in a sense, started to alleviate some of the constraints there from high rainfall. And then that, of course, is also a function of other things such as changes, varieties, and things like that. So it's not all bad news. So the tendency is for shrinkage at the dry margins, expansion at the wet margins. The unfortunate thing, though, is there's lots more area undercropping at the dry margins than there is opportunities in the wet areas where there's national parks and cities, which limit your expansion possibilities. And of course, as you go further south on Australia, on average, the temperatures tend to drop, and so some warming can, in certain areas, increase the growing season. But that's there's a pretty strong trade-off there at the moment in our scenarios with reductions in rainfall. And so you gain on the temperature swings, but you lose on the rainfall roundabout sort of thing. So that the net likely reductions are pushing down on terms of yield on average. The other part of that, of course, is in some areas where where conditions used to be too wet, down in parts of South Australia, changes in practices, including mounding type practices, can actually, again, allow crops to come into places that used to be cropped. So there's a mix of positives and negatives. Coming into all of that is change in how farmers do their business. So using new technologies, new ways of doing things to adapt, but also commensurate changes right across the value chain. So some of those things we've heard from the other speakers, changes in storage approaches, changes in trading approaches, changes in the relationships and flexibility of relationships so that we can fill in the gaps when they start to emerge.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, so GRDC is doing a lot of work in this area, and they're trying to adapt our varieties for heat tolerance and water use efficiency. And I think Amelia outlined that WA had a very dry year, or a dry year last year, but still managed to get a fairly substantial or slightly above average crop from that production. So we're forecasting about a 1 degree change in the sort of 2030 to 2040 period. Do you think that's a realistic estimate to go for in terms of temperature increases in most of the cropping belt?
Yeah. So is that directed at me?
Yes, please, Mark.
Yeah. So what we're actually seeing is temperatures going up faster over time. So there's an acceleration component, and as a result, the science assessments of when global temperatures are going to reach 1.5 has effectively come forward a decade. Compared with even a couple of years ago. So the IPCC assessment in 2018 indicated we'd exceed 1.5 above pre-industrial by about 2040. Now that's the early 2030s that's likely to occur. And so things are happening faster and faster over time. At 1 and a bit degrees global temperature increase, Australia on average, our land area has actually is much more close to about 1.8 degrees above pre-industrial, and so in a sense, our numbers are higher than the global average because they include the oceans, which tend to warm up slower. So what we're likely to see is increasing temperature challenges for our cropping. And the reason why I think that that's should be a bit of a red flag is that at the moment, what we're doing is we're by improving our varieties, improving our management, we're moving towards the production frontier. And as we approach that, that's really great. But that does actually say that there's some limits to how much better we can go. And so even though we're becoming much smarter at managing a variable climate, at some stage the climate change is going to become greater than our ability to adapt, and that's when our yields will start to push down unless we can bring in some really smart new technologies and new varieties, which essentially break down the existing trade-offs that we're seeing that limit our production ability.
Great. Okay, that's a very good place to leave it, I think. So we'll wrap it up there. So thank you again for all the speakers. That was a great job. Very interesting, I thought. I do have a couple of housekeeping notes. So there will be a short survey which will pop up shortly, and please give us your feedback. And don't forget to chat to the Spotlight with the exhibitors who will be online for the next half hour. And for all those people that provided questions online, thank you for that. And there'll be another session on climate change on Friday. So look out for that one. Cheers.
Thank you.